February 11, 1945. Guam, Marianas Islands. The sun broke over the island in clean white light, flooding the makeshift detention compound with an almost surgical brightness. The air was humid and still, heavy with the smell of coral dust and burnt aviation fuel. A line of Japanese soldiers stood barefoot on the packed earth, their uniforms torn and stained dark with sweat and seawater, some merely shreds clinging to gaunt frames. Their feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been something else, shirt sleeves, perhaps, or sections of parachute silk. Beneath the cloth, the skin was cracked and blackened, infected, swollen. One man swayed slightly, his eyes glassed over with fever. Another stared at the ground, his jaw set tight, waiting for what he had been told would come: execution, torture, or slow starvation. Instead, what arrived was a wooden crate stamped with English letters, and inside that crate were shoes. Real shoes. Not the split-toed Jikatabi canvas boots they had worn into battle, long since rotted away in the jungle mud. Not the makeshift sandals cut from truck tires that many had fashioned during the retreat. These were leather boots with rubber soles, American-made, sturdy, new. A Marine corporal opened the crate with a pry bar and began handing them out, pair by pair, checking sizes against bare feet with the efficiency of a quartermaster outfitting his own men. The Japanese soldiers did not move at first. They stood frozen, uncertain, as if the boots themselves might be some new form of psychological warfare. One prisoner, a former sergeant named Hayashi Takeo, later described the moment in an interrogation transcript filed with the War Department. "I thought they would kill us," he said. "I thought the shoes were to make us comfortable before they shot us. That is what we were told would happen if we surrendered. But then the American gave me the boots, and he nodded, and he walked away. And I held the boots in my hands, and I did not understand." To understand what those boots meant, to grasp why grown men wept when they laced them onto their feet, requires stepping back to the beginning, to the ideology that had sent these soldiers into the Pacific in the first place, and to the lies that had sustained them even as their empire burned. In the decade before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese soldier was forged in the fires of Bushido mythology and imperial dogma, shaped by a propaganda machine that taught him he was inherently superior to his enemies, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and that death in service to the emperor was the highest possible calling. From childhood, Japanese boys were indoctrinated into a culture of sacrifice that elevated the collective over the individual, the nation over the self. In schools, they recited the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, memorizing passages that equated surrender with eternal disgrace. "Do not suffer the disgrace of being taken alive as a prisoner," it commanded. In training camps, they were beaten, starved, and humiliated to strip away softness, to prepare them for a war that demanded absolute obedience. By 1941, the average Japanese infantryman believed, with genuine conviction, that he was part of a divine mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism and establish a new order under Japanese supremacy. This belief was reinforced by everything he was told about the enemy. American soldiers, according to Japanese military propaganda, were weak, decadent, and cowardly. Soft men from a soft nation, more interested in wealth and comfort than in honor or sacrifice. They were portrayed as racially inferior, culturally bankrupt, obsessed with material pleasure. The propaganda films showed Americans as criminals and gangsters, as lazy factory workers, as men who would flee at the first sign of hardship. Japanese soldiers were told that if they were captured by the Americans, they would be tortured and killed, their bodies desecrated, their families shamed forever. Surrender was not merely dishonorable, it was suicidal. And so, in the early years of the war, Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that shocked Allied commanders. They launched banzai charges into machine gun fire. They held positions until they were overrun and then detonated grenades against their own bodies. On Saipan, on Okinawa, on 100 nameless atolls, they chose death over capture. often taking their own lives rather than face the imagined horrors of American custody. But ideology, no matter how deeply embedded, cannot survive prolonged contact with reality. And by 1945, reality was closing in from every direction. The Japanese soldiers who found themselves standing barefoot on Guam in January of that year were the survivors of a catastrophic collapse. They had seen their supply lines severed, their garrisons cut off, their air cover obliterated. They had watched comrades die not from American bullets but from starvation, from disease, from infections that turned minor wounds into gangrenous death sentences. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Japanese troops had been reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and the flesh of their own dead. Medical supplies had run out months before the ammunition did. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi swept through units faster than any Allied offensive. In the Philippines, Japanese soldiers scavenged through abandoned villages, hunting rats and snakes, chewing on leather belts to quiet the grinding pain in their stomachs. The Imperial Army, once the pride of the empire, had become a ragged ghost of itself, held together only by the fading belief that suffering was noble and that the emperor would somehow deliver them. And their feet, God, their feet told the story of the entire war. In the jungles of the Pacific, feet were the first thing to break down. The canvas boots issued to Japanese soldiers at the start of the war were designed for the plains of Manchuria, not the swamps of the South Pacific. Within weeks of landing, the boots would rot, the stitching would fail, the soles would separate. Soldiers marched barefoot through mangrove swamps where the water was thick with parasites, through volcanic rock that shredded skin, through mud so deep it swallowed men whole. Fungal infections bloomed between the toes, spreading upward, turning flesh black and soft. Cuts became ulcers. Ulcers became abscesses. Men who could no longer walk were left behind, often with a single grenade and a whispered apology. By the time American forces overran the last defensive positions on Guam, many of the Japanese soldiers attempting to flee into the jungle were crawling, their feet too damaged to support their weight. When they were captured, whether through surrender or sheer physical collapse, they expected annihilation. They had been told, repeatedly, that Americans took no prisoners, that mercy was a lie, that the moment they fell into enemy hands, their suffering would truly begin. And then the Americans gave them shoes. Not immediately, of course. The process of surrender itself was chaotic and terrifying. Many Japanese soldiers, cornered in caves or bunkers, had to be coaxed out with loudspeakers, with promises shouted in broken Japanese, with the testimony of other prisoners who had survived and were willing to speak. Some emerged with their hands raised, their faces blank with shock. Others were carried out, unconscious or delirious. The Marines who processed them were often rough, understandably wary. These were men who had just spent weeks fighting an enemy that used surrender as a tactic to detonate explosives, that booby-trapped corpses, that feigned death and then opened fire. Trust was earned slowly, and the early hours of captivity were tense and uncertain. But once the initial security procedures were complete, something unexpected happened. The prisoners were given food, clean water, medical treatment, and shoes. The shoes were standard-issue American work boots, the kind given to rear echelon personnel or labor battalions. They were not luxurious, not fancy, but they were functional, intact, real. For men whose feet had been wrapped in filthy rags, who had been walking on open wounds for months, the sensation of slipping their feet into clean socks and lacing up solid boots was overwhelming. Several prisoners broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to process the simple act of receiving footwear. In the official records of the Guam POW camp, an American chaplain noted, "The Japs seem more affected by small kindnesses than by any show of force." One man cried for 20 minutes after receiving a pair of boots. Another asked, through a translator, why we were being kind to him. He said he had been told we would kill him. When I told him we follow the Geneva Convention, He did not understand. He asked what he had done to deserve shoes. What had he done to deserve shoes? The question revealed the depth of the ideological chasm that separated the Japanese soldier from his American captor. In the world the prisoner had come from, kindness was transactional, conditional, hierarchical. You received what your rank and your obedience earned you, and nothing more. Compassion for the defeated, for the weak, for the enemy, was incomprehensible. It was not part of the moral framework. The Japanese soldier had been taught that the strong dominate and the weak submit, that mercy is a luxury only the victor can afford to grant or withhold. To be given something, especially something as fundamental as footwear, without having earned it, without being forced to beg or debase himself, shattered the assumptions he had carried into war. The phenomenon was not unique to Guam. Across the Pacific, in camps on Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the Philippines, and eventually on the Japanese home islands after the surrender, American forces encountered the same reaction again and again. Japanese prisoners, expecting brutality, received instead the routine decencies of the Allied detention system. They were fed 3 meals a day, meals that, by the standards of the starving Imperial Army, were unimaginably abundant. They were given medical care that included surgery, antibiotics, and dental work. They were housed in barracks that, while Spartan, were clean and dry. And they were given clothing and footwear that restored a measure of basic human dignity. The psychological impact was profound. For many prisoners, the first few days in American custody were marked by a kind of cognitive dissonance so intense it bordered on traumatic. Everything they had been told was wrong. The Americans were not monsters. They did not torture. They did not execute. They followed rules, rules that protected even the enemy. This realization did not come easily. Some prisoners remained suspicious for weeks, refusing to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others waited in silent dread for the punishment they believed was inevitable. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the evidence became undeniable. The Americans meant what they said. The war, for the prisoner, was over. And survival was not only possible, it was expected. The shoes became a symbol of this new reality. They were tangible proof that the propaganda had been a lie, that the world was not as they had been told. In interrogation reports and post-war memoirs, Japanese prisoners repeatedly cited the moment they received footwear as a turning point, the instant when they began to believe they might live. Sergeant Hayashi Takeo, the man who had expected execution, later wrote, "When I put on the boots, I felt as though I had been born again. I had been dead inside, resigned to my fate. But the boots made me real again. They made me a man, not a ghost. I could not understand why the enemy would do this. I had killed their soldiers. I had tried to kill them. And yet they gave me shoes." It was the first act of humanity I had experienced in 3 years of war. This was not sentimentality on the part of the Americans. It was policy, rooted in a combination of legal obligation, strategic calculation, and a certain strain of democratic idealism that distinguished the United States from both its enemies and, at times, even its allies. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required signatories to treat prisoners of war humanely, to provide adequate food, shelter, and medical care, and to protect them from violence and humiliation. Japan had signed the convention but never ratified it, and in practice, Japanese forces ignored it entirely, subjecting Allied prisoners to forced labor, starvation, and systematic brutality. The United States, by contrast, adhered to the convention not because it was reciprocated. It was not, but because American military leadership believed that maintaining legal and moral standards was essential to the nation's identity and to the legitimacy of its cause. There were practical reasons as well. Prisoners who were treated humanely were more likely to cooperate, to provide intelligence, to assist in labor details. A starving, brutalized captive was useless. A fed, clothed prisoner could be put to work building roads, unloading ships, or translating documents. American commanders understood that every prisoner who surrendered voluntarily was one less enemy soldier they had to kill, and that encouraging surrender saved American lives. Dropping leaflets over Japanese positions, promising fair treatment and adequate food, was a psychological operation as much as a humanitarian gesture. But it only worked if the promise was kept. And so, the shoes were distributed, the meals were served, and the medical tents were opened, not out of softness, but out of a cold-eyed recognition that this was how you won a war without becoming the thing you were fighting. But there was something else at work, too, something harder to quantify but no less real. The American soldier, for all his faults and prejudices, carried with him a set of assumptions about fairness and decency that were the products of a democratic society. He had grown up in a country where the individual mattered, where rights were enshrined in law, where even the guilty were entitled to a trial. These values were not always honored in practice, particularly for racial minorities and the disenfranchised, but they were part of the national mythology, part of the story Americans told themselves about who they were. When the Marine corporal handed out boots to Japanese prisoners, he was not making a grand philosophical statement. He was simply doing what seemed right, what seemed normal. In his world, you did not leave a man barefoot if you had shoes to spare. You did not let wounds fester if you had medicine. You did not humiliate the defeated because cruelty was beneath you. This was the quiet power of American abundance and American ideology. It made decency routine. The Japanese prisoners struggled to make sense of it. In their world, hierarchy was absolute. The strong ruled, and the weak obeyed. There was no middle ground, no concept of universal rights or intrinsic dignity. A prisoner was, by definition, without honor, and therefore without value. To treat such a person with respect was incomprehensible. And yet, here were the Americans doing exactly that. They spoke to prisoners without shouting. They provided medical care to wounded enemies. They allowed prisoners to practice their religion, to write letters home, to organize camp councils. In some camps, prisoners were even paid for their labor, a small wage, to be sure, but the idea that an enemy captive could earn money was staggering. The abundance was what astonished them most. The food, the supplies, the sheer quantity of material goods that flowed into the camps, it was beyond anything they had imagined. Japanese soldiers had spent years on starvation rations, had watched their supply convoys sunk by submarines, had seen entire divisions reduced to eating roots and insects. Now, as prisoners, they ate better than they had as free men. Breakfast was oatmeal, bread, and coffee. Lunch was soup and sandwiches. Dinner was meat, potatoes, and vegetables. There were second helpings. There was fruit. There was milk. In the Guam camp, one prisoner gained 40 pounds in 2 months. Another, a former officer, wrote in his diary, "I do not understand this country. They have so much, and they share it even with us. We were told America was weak because it was rich. Now I see that it is strong because it is rich. They do not need to starve their soldiers. They do not need to steal food from conquered lands. They have enough for everyone, even their enemies. This is a kind of power we never possessed." The shoes, in this context, were more than footwear. They were a microcosm of everything the Japanese soldier had failed to understand about his enemy. They represented industrial capacity, logistical efficiency, and a societal wealth so vast that even prisoners of war could be outfitted with new boots as a matter of routine. They represented a legal and moral framework that extended rights to the defeated. And they represented a cultural attitude that valued human life, even enemy life, in a way that the Imperial Japanese Army never had. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the flow of prisoners increased. After the fall of Okinawa in June 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians entered American custody. After the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, the trickle became a flood. By the end of 1945, more than 40,000 Japanese prisoners were held in camps across the Pacific and the continental United States. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of disarmed soldiers in Japan itself, men who had laid down their weapons and waited, in dazed silence, to see what the conquerors would do. What the conquerors did was feed them, clothe them, put them to work rebuilding the country they had destroyed. The occupation of Japan, for all its complexities and contradictions, was marked by a degree of restraint and even generosity that shocked the Japanese population. There were no mass executions, no campaigns of retribution. The war crimes trials targeted leadership, not the rank and file. American soldiers handed out chocolate bars to Japanese children. American engineers helped restore water and power systems. And in the POW camps, the routine continued: 3 meals a day, medical care, and yes, shoes. The former prisoners did not forget. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became one of the most prosperous democracies in the world, many of those men spoke publicly about their experiences in American custody. They described the shock of humane treatment, the confusion and gratitude, the slow realization that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. Hayashi Takeo, the sergeant who had wept over his boots, became a schoolteacher in Osaka. In his classroom, he kept a pair of old American work boots on a shelf, and every year he told his students the story of the day he was given shoes by the enemy. "I learned then," he would say, "that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that abundance is a kind of strength, that the Americans won the war not only with bombs and bullets but with the way they treated us after we lost. They gave us shoes. And in doing so, they gave us a reason to believe in a different future." There is a tendency, in the telling of history, to reduce wars to grand strategies and decisive battles, to focus on the generals and the politicians and the turning points that shifted the balance of power. But wars are also won and lost in the small moments, in the everyday interactions between soldiers and civilians, captors and captives. They are won in the distribution of boots to barefoot prisoners, in the decision to follow the rules even when the enemy does not, in the quiet assertion that some standards are worth upholding no matter the cost. The Japanese soldiers who stood on Guam in January 1945, holding new boots in their trembling hands, did not surrender because of those boots. They surrendered because they had been defeated, because the war was lost, because their feet were ruined and their bodies broken and they had no choice left. But the boots mattered. They mattered because they were the first evidence that survival was possible, that the enemy was not the demon they had been taught to fear. They mattered because they were a promise kept, a signal that the world on the other side of surrender was governed by rules, by law, by a kind of decency that transcended hatred. And in the end, that was the quiet victory that no propaganda could obscure, no ideology could deny. The Americans did not win the Pacific War solely through superior firepower or industrial might, though both were essential. They won because they carried with them a vision of the world that could absorb even the enemy, that could extend dignity even to the defeated. The boots were a symbol of that vision, practical, unadorned, but undeniably real. They were a reminder that abundance shared is stronger than scarcity hoarded, that mercy extended is more powerful than cruelty inflicted, that the measure of a nation is not only in how it treats its own, but in how it treats those who have nothing left to give. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The boots wore out, were discarded, were replaced. But the memory endured. In a small classroom in Osaka, in the stories told by old men to their grandchildren, in the quiet recognition that the enemy had given them something they did not have to give, not just shoes, but the possibility of a different world, a world where even the defeated could walk again.